But somebody who can really talk about that is Natasha Lamoureux, who is coordinator for the Community of Practice and Outreach, Women, Peace, and Security at UN Women, which is a real UN kind of name for an organization. And she's going to talk about a gendered approach to preventing and countering violent extremism and the introduction of the new UN Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism curriculum in Europe and Central Asia. We'll get to this maybe a little bit more when it comes to our discussion there at the table, but I'll be interested to hear too, Natasha, about the role that women may sometimes play as instigators of terrorist action. Because in the years that I've been covering terrorism, it has struck me on a number of occasions that men were listening to women who were telling them they had to go out and maybe even be martyrs, which I guess is one way of getting rid of a husband you don't want. But in any case, Natasha, please come on up.
Good evening. Thank you so much. Those videos were really inspiring. The story of how you're going and getting the interviews of the people who are exactly the people we need to hear from, I think is really inspiring, but also we need to do so much more of that. So thank you so much, distinguished guests, colleagues. Thank you to Anne. Thank you to the International Center for having me here tonight on behalf of UN Women. I'm really honored to be here tonight to talk about the role of gender in preventing violent extremism. It's really critical, and I'm also delighted to talk a little bit more about UN Women's work in Europe and Central Asia, which I'll get to in a little bit. I want to start by talking about a few of the things that we do know. So we know that women all over the world are deeply affected by violent extremism. We know that violent extremists and terrorists target women and girls. They target women's rights and gender equality. This is not new to us, unfortunately. The push and pull factors for women are really no different than those for men. Women also want adventure. They're not just jihadi brides. They're not just passive victims who accompany their husbands. They want adventure. They're seeking freedom from their own oppression. They want a purer version of Islam. They want all the kinds of things that men want. But there's also a gendered aspect where many women that we're hearing from want to exercise agency in a way that they're unable to do so in their own communities. And ISIS and groups like ISIS are very adept at selling an utopian version that appeals to women and men alike. We know that women are not just victims or perpetrators. We know they are working at the front lines to prevent and counter violent extremism, but we also know that despite this, very few efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism take gender into account. We know also that the very promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment is itself an effective countermeasure to the spread of violent extremism and terrorism. But we also know that for women and women's organizations to have a real role in preventing and countering violent extremism, we need more research and analysis on the women and women's involvement and gender in violent extremism, particularly on gendered drivers and the role that gender in PCVE plays. And that includes more primary and secondary research. We need more inclusion of women in the development of PCVE programming, in actions and plans and interventions. We need a greater awareness among women themselves about the threats to PCVE in their communities, and we need more consideration about how poorly implemented PCVE programming can actually negatively affect women's rights. At UN Women, we have long seen links between gender inequality, violence, and conflict prevention, And in the past several years, we're pleased to have been increasing our focus in this area of work, working much more closely with other UN agencies, like my esteemed colleague here with CTED, OCT, and other agencies. And we're working with a growing number of scholars and experts like Anne, who are helping us to bridge some of the gaps that I just mentioned. We partner with local women and women-led organizations on the ground who are working in their communities, again, often at great risk to themselves and their families, to counter and prevent violent extremism, but also to de-radicalize and reintegrate those who have either escaped or become disillusioned with groups like ISIS and others. This work is critically important and needs much more support. To support these women and men who are working to prevent violent extremism on the front lines, strong training materials are essential. We're pleased to partner with Anne and her colleagues on developing a training manual on women and preventing and countering violent extremism in Central Asia. We anticipate this toolkit will launch by the end of the year, if not sooner. And I want to thank Anne and her colleague Ardian for their amazing work. And then also, if Grace is here, Grace Escamilla, she was the editor, and it's just really fantastic. This manual will give participants gender analysis tools that they can implement in promoting mainstreaming of gender into local PCVE initiatives, and we are certain that this is going to make those initiatives both more effective and better aligned with international norms and standards. I think that ensuring that our interventions when it comes to PCVE are gender responsive, inclusive, and aligned with international norms and standards, especially those around human rights, is key to meeting the challenge of violent extremism head-on and creating clear and credible alternatives for those who are at risk of becoming radicalized into violent extremism terrorist groups, as well as creating clear and credible pathways out of violent extremism. I'm really excited for the conversation that we will be having with all of you and to share more details about our work, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Sounds like a great program and absolutely vital. I don't think that nearly enough attention has been paid to the whole question of women in these movements, and particularly the question of how they will come back home again, as Selma was talking about. Is that ever going to be possible?